Hello again, and welcome to week 7, over the hump part of our course with total 12 lessons. So we're moving through this at a good pace. Well, 2 lessons this particular week in summarizing this teaching in the book of Exodus, beginning with the explanation of the tabernacle. First, we're going to back up to looking at the Gospel of John, that is more familiar in the New Testament, talking about that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, meaning the Word, was in the beginning with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt, or actually the Greek word here means or tabernacled among us. So we're looking forward into the New Testament. We're looking at the person of Jesus coming in the flesh and dwelling among us, living among us. And the purpose of the tabernacle is very much the same. It was to be this representation, physical representation of God in the midst of the Israelites. And that is what they would have understood. In different translations of John chapter 1, it might mean that he pitched his tent or he tabernacled among us. And so even now, more so, if we think about the first of these, pitching his tent, and the tabernacle was in a tent being carried as they moved through the desert during the Exodus and proceeded there accordingly. So this does help us to understand the purpose of the tabernacle, in that it's the same root word as we see here in John 1. Okay, back to the Exodus. What we have now is this situation where there are 3 very important parts of the Exodus. The beginning part that we're seeing begins in chapter 12 and moves through near the end of chapter 17. And that deals with the initial leaving from under the bondage of the Pharaoh, going forward into the desert, being led by Moses during this time, and what we will come to see is the beginning of what is a much longer venture than what they might have anticipated. It actually turned out to be 40 years long, and I'm sure they were more of the mindset that it was going to be maybe a matter of weeks until they reached the promised land. So the first part that we cover is Exodus and the Passover, established to release the Israelis from the bondage of Pharaoh. The second big main part, for about 6 chapters, starting in chapter 18, deals with the giving by God of the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. And then the third part of it is this part that we're talking about in the most part of our message here, and that is the actual physical construction of the tabernacle and what it stood for. Before we do that, so in parts C and D of the outline, what we see, this covers the patriarchal period, when we had a number of people that God had chosen to represent him. There were various passages that in the Old Testament talking about them providing open sacrifices to God in the fields of different animals. We see this very early in the 2 sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and them coming forward before God to offer a sacrifice. So it goes literally almost back to the beginning of time as we know it, established in the Bible. We also see an alternative of some buildings of altars at various locations. Noah built one after the flood. He came out of the ark, came down, built an altar, and worshiped God. Abraham, as we see after the encounter with God and Isaac, the potential sacrifice of Isaac, built one after receiving the covenant. So these were all unique altars, if you will, or places that were consecrations of specific events that had happened in time, and also at specific locations that were considered to be sacred. So specific grounds, if you will, were considered these sacred due to the unique occurrences that happened in those places, be they from the flood or also from the encounter that Abraham had with God regarding the establishment of the covenant of grace. So we now move into section E and are addressing, if you will, the main crux of the study today, and that has to do with why was there the need for the tabernacle at all. It was also called the tent of meetings or the worship place, and it was needed to be constructed and easily transported because every day the Israelis would pick up from their campsites, move on for some period of time, reestablish a campsite, and either daily or at least over the course of a number of days would also gather together and worship. So the Exodus was beginning. They had just left Egypt, and it was unknown to them how long they would be in this mode. Turned out to be 40 years, so it was very important that God provided this place to be a place that was mobile for them to give worship and remember what God had done for them. We know well, and will learn even that many more times, that this is a people that have a history of forgetting what God has done for them, much like we do. And they will see this continuation of pattern even after they occupied the promised land, and we end our study with this nation being sent into exile. So we continue on now dealing with the tabernacle being in the campsite. And one other unique part of this is that the tabernacle was always placed in the middle of the camp. It was very common for the camp to be set up circular. And as we have drawings that have been passed down in time, they would have various surroundings to the middle and then just keep encircling and circling further out and further out. This was to symbolize a couple things. One is that God should be and needs to be the center of our focus, and also the center of his being, if you will, providing a common middle access to all of his people. Historically, in nomadic people, whoever was the leader of the tribe, the king's tent or the leader's tent was always placed in the middle of the camp. Some of this was to be for defensive reasons, in case they were attacked from outside, that it would be the furthest away from the attackers. And there would be lines of defense, if you will, but they would be actually circles of defense from all sides. The other part that this begins to lead to and foretell is the fact that there will be a king in their future. And so this kind of transition from a nomadic tribe type of structure to a more God-ordained structure of the way that they should establish themselves, in the way that they should think about God being in their midst and in the center of their midst, was a very important part to this story. So this ends lesson 7a, lecture time. If you looked at the bonus, you can look at the bonus material, and instead of a roughly 8.5 minute talk that I've given to you going through the first 5 or 6 parts of this, you can see there are other sections about the dimensions of the tabernacle, the instruments that are used, the details of the Ark of the Covenant, think Raiders of the Lost Ark, and recognize that the whole work of redemption, mercy, and judgment was found in these living symbols that are outlined. So there's a number of chapters that go through this. We are not dealing with that in any specifics in this particular course, but you're welcome, if you have the extra time, to spend going through RC's lecture on this that's provided in lesson 7a under bonus materials at the bottom of your list. Look forward to talking to you some more in lesson 7b. See you in a few minutes. Bye-bye.